Welcome. My name's Kathy and I work for Central Coast Library Service here in New South Wales, Australia. Couldn't be any further away from where Lizzie is at the moment. Thank you so much for joining us, everybody. And we'd just like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands on which we meet today and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I extend my respects to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us here today. We're joined this evening by award-winning journalist and travel writer Lizzie Pook. Lizzie began her career writing for women's magazines covering everything from cognitive enhancing drugs to conspiracy theorists. In 2015, she moved into travel journalism, reporting for publications Lonely Planet, Rough Guides, The Sunday Times and more. Her assignments have taken her to some of the most remote parts of the world, from the uninhabited east coast of Greenland in search of roaming polar bears to the haunted mountains of the Trans-Himalayas to track endangered snow leopards. She's here with us this evening to discuss her debut novel, Moonlight and the Pearler's Daughter. And we'd just like to welcome Lizzie.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. It's lovely to be here. And it's lovely to be connecting, with technology from the other side of the world. So the joys of technology, hey?
Yeah, so Lizzie is all the way in London, and I apologise if I put it wrong anywhere, but Lizzie is actually not Australian. She's actually English, but she's written a book set in Australia. So if that's anywhere in our publications, that's my error. But we'd just like to welcome you. And I'm actually going to start off with a question of, this book has only just been published. It's beautiful. I love it.
Yay.
Yay. It's such a beautiful cover, and it's a great read. I'm up to, because it's only just been published in the last couple of days. I've had 2 days to read it, and I'm up to chapter 41, so it's all starting to come
you're doing
together.
well. Yeah, you're doing well.
Starting to come back. Oh, the brilliance of audiobooks where you can increase the speed of the reading. Yeah. It's fabulous. So it's only just been published, so not everyone's had a chance to get their hands on a copy yet. Could you just give us a little bit of a taste about what the book is all about?
Sure. So Moonlight and the Pearler's Daughter is a historical novel set against the backdrop of the dangerous pearl diving industry in 19th century Western Australia. Our protagonist is Eliza Brightwell, a young, very strong-willed British woman whose family has sailed across to the remote community of Bannon Bay to establish a foothold in the lucrative pearl shell industry. But one day, when Eliza's father, the eccentric captain of a pearling lugger, goes missing from his ship under suspicious circumstances, it falls to Eliza to uncover the truth of what has actually happened to him. And as she scours the streets of Bannon Bay and eventually the seas beyond, she uncovers corruption, prejudice, blackmail, and lots of long-buried secrets.
There's quite a few secrets in there, and so we have to be very, very careful that we don't put any spoilers in this conversation for those who haven't read it. Because it's historical fiction, there's a lot of it that's quite detailed with the information. What kind of research did you have to do for that?
Gosh, it really was a research process that was spread across 2 continents and took, a matter of years. So while I was able to get out to Australia, I did all sorts of things, from sort of trawling through historical archives at the Broome Historical Society, walking the landscapes with guides, interviewing everyone from crocodile wranglers to naturalists to bus drivers, just to get a flavour of, this part of the world and what it would have been like at that time in this part of the world. Travelled up to Cape Leveque in the Beagle Bay community to see their really beautiful, they've got a church there where the altar is inlaid completely with pearl shell. And that was something that was made by Aboriginal women at the turn of the century. and just threw myself into as much research as I could possibly do while actually out on the ground in Australia. But then obviously I am English. And so when back in the UK, I was doing as much research as I could in the British Library here. So that was sort of spending hours poring over reference books, memoirs, diaries from master pearlers, sort of anything that I could get my hands on. So it was a very immersive research process, but obviously I was doing all this alongside my job as a journalist and while also traveling around the world and doing stuff like that. So it was quite piecemeal at first, just doing whatever I could. But yeah, it was a labor of love, I would say. But it was, I found everything about it fascinating, and I think that's what sort of maintained my energy levels for so long and my interest in the subject.
Yeah, because you seem to have quite a lot of information from the pearling industry itself to the boats to the way that the people were treated in it's Bannon, isn't it? Is it
Bannon Bay? Yes, which is fictional. It's a fictionalized setting, but it's based on the early sort of pearling hubs. But yeah, there was just so much to include. Yeah.
You've done a good job. Did it compare to did your travel writing help to sort of set the scene for it?
I think so. I think when your job is to try and encapsulate the flavor of a place in, you might be writing an article that's 800 words or something. I think you do have to learn how to immerse yourself in that place very quickly and then try and get the flavor of that place across to readers. So I do think it helped in that sense. But journalism, and this is something that's probably surprised me most in the writing process of this book, is that I thought, because I was a journalist and I was used to writing, every day and writing quickly, writing a book, that's going to be a breeze. That's just like journalism. Turns out, no, it's not. It's completely different, and it uses a completely different set of muscles and part of the brain. And so it actually took me a while to get used to making stuff up, basically, because obviously when you're a journalist, everything that you write has happened, or it has to be so incredibly factual and correct. And while there was a lot of historical research that went into this book, essentially I was making up a story, and so that actually didn't come naturally at first, and that was an interesting transition. So definitely a learning process.
So all in all, how long did it take you from start to finish to write this book?
The research process was, like I said, stretching over a period of years, but sort of focused in for maybe about a year before I properly started writing the book. The actual writing of it, probably about a year and a half, but that again was around an office job or trips around the world, and so fitting it in. I think now I'm writing a second book and I have a deadline looming over me, and that's been a much shorter process because I've just been focused on that. I think lots of writers, when they're approaching their first book, they're doing it alongside other things, so it can take a bit longer. But I would say in front of the computer, sort of bashing away at the keys, probably about a year and a half.
That's pretty good going for your first book, apart from all the research stuff.
Yeah, you see, you take away the research and it's good, but with the research, it's sort of several years.
So you mentioned that you are working on another book. When can we expect that? And is it a similar kind of style?
It's similar in that it places a sort of active, strong-willed female character at the center of a narrative that is normally quite male. So that's something that I wanted to do with this book. I read lots of sort of 19th century adventure fiction while I was writing this book, and it's so macho. It's just filled with men and sort of dashing white male adventurers doing brilliant stand-up things. And I wanted to put a woman at the center of that, see how she would get on, basically. And so that is something that I've done similarly with book 2. It's not a sequel to this book, it's a standalone book. And whereas the setting for Moonlight and Pearl's Daughter is very sort of hot and sunny and sweltering, the setting for book 2 is very cold and very icy.
Still in Australia?
No, it's not in Australia, but
we do have cold and icy here.
Yeah, no, it's not. It's definitely it's down towards it's southern hemisphere, let's just say. But okay. That's not to say I've already got ideas for book 3 and book 4, and then lots of them are sort of Australia, New Zealand based. It's one of my favorite places in the world. So I would definitely continue to write about it.
Yeah, and I guess the difference is that you haven't had the opportunity to travel as much lately.
Yeah, that's been obviously that's been difficult for everybody, and there are people who haven't been able to see their loved ones for years, and so it's certainly not as bad as that. But when you're someone who is used to being on the ground during your research process, and I'm a very visual writer. I really like to see things and feel things and smell things to be able to sort of replicate them. It's been harder to do the research for this second book without being able to travel, but hopefully things will open up soon and I'll be able to get out there and throw myself into research again, because that's the fun bit, really.
Somebody's written in the post ideas for books 3 and 4. Can I borrow one? Are we up to 3 and 4?
Do you know what I think? I think each writer has their thing that they struggle with. And mine has never been coming up with ideas. It's always been, the actual applying those ideas and putting the words down and actually coming up with the book. So, while those ideas might be floating around in my head, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be easy to actually write those books. So I constantly write down ideas. I have put them in the notes app in my phone. If I see something on the telly that interests me, if I see somebody talking about something, a weird historical fact on Facebook, I'll put that down in my notes and say, oh, could this be a book? So it's just a constant process of sort of picking things out from the cultural ether and seeing if I can turn them into something novel length.
So how did you come up with WA?
So it was actually when I was traveling with my husband through Western Australia. So we were driving from Perth to Darwin. I love WA, by the way. I just think it's just so vast and beautiful and varied. And we ended up in Broome. We sort of rolled into Broome, and really it just looked like paradise. It's one of those places that has, it has to be seen to be believed. It's incredibly beautiful with its sort of crimson Pindon soil and its milky aquamarine seas and its mangroves. It really does look like paradise. But actually, when you delve beneath the surface of it, it has quite a dark history to tell, as lots of places in Australia do, considering white settlement and what happened, how white settlers treated Indigenous communities at the time. But also this pearling industry, I had no idea that the pearling industry was so incredibly dangerous and so brutal. And it was actually when we ended up, we were just strolling around Broome and ended up in this place called Willie Creek Pearls. And they have a full-size pearling lugger there, a ship. They have a hard hat, sort of copper helmet that you can try on. And they do these talks basically about the pearling industry. And I was initially just really interested in, men descending to the seabed in these really heavy copper helmets and these canvas suits that sort of crushed their, left creases on their body because the pressure of the sea was so strong. And they came up against sharks and crocodiles and whales, and their air pipes could sometimes become entangled in the flukes of whales and they'd be dragged through the water and they could drown, or they came up against the diver's paralysis, which we now call the bends. And I just thought, this is so fascinating. And also Broome in the mid 19th century was actually quite anomalous on Australian soil, in that there were people from all over the world who descended on this quite tiny township, people from America, Asia, the Caribbean, Europe. And it was like a gold rush town, basically. They all descended and sort of rubbed up against one another, all in the pursuit of pearls and pearl shell. And I just thought this was a fascinating, sort of lesser known, certainly in the UK, part of British Australian history and world history. And it was just a sort of an obsession that came from there.
It's certainly not unique to not know about it, because I'm in Australia and I didn't know about it, but I'm on the other side of Australia. Give me that. I've never been to WA.
Yeah, I've had that a lot with Australian people saying, oh, I feel so guilty because I never knew about this stuff. You know,
Definitely.
nobody knows. And that's what I found so interesting about it, being able to, and in the research process that actually showed, you know, there wasn't a infinite number of resources about this subject. Whereas perhaps if you're writing about Victorian London, there are so many books you could try and get your hands on. Whereas, you know, broom and purling at this particular time, there aren't loads and loads of resources. So you can't actually sort of drown in resources. You just use whatever you can get and take from there. So yeah, it was fascinating to me to learn about this new part of history and try and tell that history also in an entertaining way. You know, I didn't want this to be, you know, an issues book that is just about how Indigenous people were treated at this time. That is a very important part of the book, but I also wanted it to be a compelling adventure story and an immersive read, a page-turning read, and something that explored other themes like grief and loss and love of the natural world and father-daughter relationships and friendships and things like that. I like to see the book as sort of a collection of little love stories about lots of different things. So that was my aim anyway.
Yeah. Well, I think it came across that way because, yeah, it had so many different elements in it. And another element, speaking of father, I'm just going to let Bella in here. Speaking of elements that the father was quite interested in native bird life. And as you can see, I've got galahs and kookaburra behind me here. How did that come about?
Do you know what? My father was fascinated with birds and the natural world and really sort of imparted that love to us as well. And so I grew up with that fascination. You know, we'd go to wetlands reserves here in the UK, or if we were in Scotland, we'd go to camera trap sites and see if we could see the ospreys and things like that. So that was definitely something that was drawn from personal experience. And I have an enduring love with the natural world, and especially in terms of my job as a travel writer, I was always driven by what animals I could see in these various places that I traveled to, you know, hence in the bio that you had at the beginning, you know, I was very much driven by seeing polar bears or whales or snow leopards or things like that. To me, that's a really magical experience. And so I wanted that to come through in the book, but I also wanted to give the birds in the book, and there are lots of birds in the book, as you've mentioned. Charles is very interested in that sort of thing. I also wanted to lend them some symbolism as well. So there are occasions in the book where particular birds arrive alongside particular characters, and you really have to read it, you know, at a granular level to see that. And it's probably something that only I will ever notice. But I had a lot of fun in sort of giving this natural world some symbolic meaning as well. And there's also a sort of silent narrator character in the book who is a cockatoo. So during my research, I came across a bosun from the Caribbean who was called Conrad Gill, and he would walk around Broome with a talking parrot on his shoulder, and the parrot would, you know, the men would feed it rum, and it would sing sea shanties, and it would steal money, and it was this sort of really crazy character in Broome. And so I wanted to create a similar thing in my book, and so there is a cockatoo character in my book who sometimes silently guides the reader to certain clues by doing certain things and flying in certain places. So yeah, it's definitely a book for people who like birds.
Yeah, definitely. It's yeah, as you can tell, I like birds, and I really picked up on the bird theme in there. And you also are quite descriptive of the different animals that you find and the way that they're treated. So the crocodile, the saltwater crocodiles are a good example of that, and the whales that beach themselves.
Yeah.
How difficult were those scenes to write? That was quite a sad scene. Put it out there for people, sorry.
Yeah, it is quite a sad scene. I think because with that scene, I wasn't trying to get across the fact that these whales had beached themselves, and these whales have beached themselves because one of their pod is sick, and so whales, if they live together as a family, can often not survive if one of their pod is gone, you know. And so that is why I included that scene in the book, because it speaks so much about family and grief. So parts of these books were really emotional to write. Actually, all of this book was really emotional to write, but I am a very emotional writer, and that is what sort of compels me to keep going. I would much rather write a scene like that than, so for example, one of the technically hardest scenes in my book to write was a dinner party scene, just because for me it wasn't a particularly emotional scene, so it didn't come as easily as the whales, the night of the whales. And so yes, it can be tough, but I actually find those things the easiest to write.
And just a quick question about your necklace. Yolande asked, did your pearl necklace come from Broome?
Do you know what? It's a pearl shell, and this is actually a leopard. So I don't own any pearl jewelry, and this is something that I got asked in another interview. They said, "Have you changed the way that you see pearls?" Because obviously pearls have this very romantic sort of veneer. And obviously they're cultured now, they're farmed. Pearls are sort of sourced in a different way. But I have been to Broome and seen the beautiful pearl jewelry that you have out there. And I visited pearl farms as well, sort of out on the Dampier Peninsula, Signet Bay Pearl Farm, and they have incredible jewelry there. And you can hold these sort of pearls that are almost the shape of your eyeball. And, you know, back in the day, those things would have been worth thousands and thousands of pounds. And for a pearler to come across something like that, you know, they would be made for life by coming across a beautiful pearl like that. And the chances of finding a pearl like that were, you know, 1 in 10,000 or something like that. So it did happen, because obviously they were bringing up so much pearl shell. But yes, I don't have a lot of pearl jewelry, interestingly enough.
And let me see, what does a typical day writing look like for you?
It depends on what stage I'm at in the writing process. So the hardest part for me is the first draft stage. And I know other writers are different. Some writers love this part because they find it so freeing and they can write whatever they want, and they can, you know, it's such a lovely creative time. But actually I find first draft quite a slog, because it's just a numbers game and it's just getting the words down. So if I'm trying to write a first draft of the book, I will set myself a target of a reachable target of about 1,000 words a day. And then if I surpass that, then fine, but I will allow myself to feel happy that I've at least achieved something. So I'm not an early bird. I wish I was, but I don't get up at sort of 5 a.m. and sort of with a cup of coffee and start writing. Definitely not. I just sort of drag myself out of bed and get ready for the day. And my most productive time, weirdly, is probably around sort of 3 or 4 p.m. when most other people are sort of starting to flag. So it might be that I walk or swim in the morning, or just do whatever I can do to rest, and then I'll write for a few hours in the afternoon to get those 1,000 words down. So once I've got that first draft, I actually transfer that book in terms of plot points to post-it notes, and I plaster my wall with post-it notes so I can see the bones of the story on my wall. And it's only when I can see that sort of as a whole that I can start moving things around and realizing, that doesn't quite work there. We need to have, you know, a turning point here. We need to have a clue here. We need to do this, this, this. So I'll then change the whole order of everything and then go through a second draft, and then inevitably a fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, you know, 9th, 10th, 12th drafts. It's endless. So yeah, it's a long process.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm just thinking, is it so you kind of a pantser to start with, and then a bit of a plotter?
Well, I do plan to start in that, not sort of forensically, but I will have a Word document with perhaps a paragraph for each chapter on what needs to happen in that chapter. I can't actually pants, which for people who might not know is flying by the seat of your pants in terms of writing a book. So you haven't planned what you're going to write and say. But inevitably that loose plan I have changes massively. You know, it never ends up as the actual final plot of the book, but I do need a steer, otherwise I feel like I'm just sort of freewheeling or falling off a cliff. You know, I wouldn't know what to do. So I do refer to that, and yes, as I said, it inevitably changes.
So how much How much was involved in the editing from your editor? Because I know lots of writers sometimes say, oh yes, they made me chuck out so many words and I had to rewrite again. Was that challenging being your first book?
Well, what was actually interesting was that I had 4 editors. So I had an editor in the UK, an editor in the US, an editor in Australia, and an editor in Canada. So they actually all came together to provide feedback on the manuscript. So my editorial note, which is the letter that you get once your publisher has bought your book and that these are the changes that they're suggesting. My editorial note actually encompassed thoughts from 4 editors. So I had to sort of try and approach that. Thankfully, they all agreed in what needed to be done. And I actually changed lots myself during that process because I just felt that the book needed it, and thankfully they were open to that. So there were a few changes in terms of stripping out some characters, speeding up the pace in certain parts, which is fairly sort of standard for an editor to ask you to do. But I see it as a privilege to be edited like that. It felt like I was being given a cheat code for a computer game or something like that. It was like, hang on, you're going to tell me, you are an expert in this and you're going to tell me how I can make this better. So I think while it might be, it might feel like you want, the knee-jerk reaction might be, I can't possibly make any of these changes. It's my book, you know, I've worked so hard on this. When you have people who want your book to succeed and they're saying, I wonder if we can do this, it actually feels like quite a privilege.
So trust in the process.
Trust in the process, definitely. And it was it was quite a long, it was a few months editing this book sort of full time, but it definitely made it a better book.
So are you still working as a journalist?
On and off, but to be at the moment I don't have time, but which is great. It's lovely to be able to focus full time on novel writing. And growing up I never thought that was a feasible career path. It just didn't come up. I thought that authors were men in, privately educated men in their 70s, quaffing 100%, with paneled walls and sort of reclining and writing. I never thought it was a career path. So to be doing that, it feels amazing. So yeah.
And you've made it.
Great. Well, doesn't it, I think that's interesting. If you say that to any author, they're like, oh no, I still feel, it's a really vulnerable and exposing thing. And I don't know I certainly don't know many authors, especially debut authors, because it's been really lovely to get to know other debut authors during this process. I certainly don't know many of them who would feel as if they've made it, because I think it's just a constant thing, and your goalposts change, and there's always something new coming, and there's always the next book, or there's always perhaps another deal, or there's always, hopefully your book gets translated in another language. There's always something to be sort of thinking about and working towards, and I think that's good. I think certainly if I felt that I'd made it, I think that would probably make me quite static. But there's, I think there's creativity to be found in sort of feeling nervous and anxious about what's next.
Yeah, for sure. Sounds like a very, very busy time. Speaking of other authors and debut authors, do you have a favorite author that you like to read?
I'm really, I'm not actually very loyal when it comes to books, but I mean that in the sense that I read so many different genres and all sorts of different books. So I do read a lot of historical fiction, and in that sense I love authors like Hannah Kent and Kieran Millward Hargrave and Jessie Burton, and things like that. But I also read a lot of non-fiction as well. One of my favorite books is a book by a brain surgeon, a British brain surgeon, called Do No Harm, and it's just about the general weight of being, one of the country's leading brain surgeons and having people's lives in your hands, literally. And so I read all sorts of things. I mean, there are books I'm reading at the moment that I can chat about, but yeah, I just, and there are certain authors I would buy everything that they write. But I also like to read a lot of debut novels as well, just see what people are doing and sort of immerse myself in everything. And so that's really lovely. And when you're a debut author, the best thing is that you get to read books early. People send you their books before they're even out, which is a real privilege and a really, really exciting thing to do. So it's been really lovely to be able to read the debuts of sort of my peers, I guess. That's been really exciting.
And I've got a question here that Alex is the lady that I work with, and she's written it. If you could be part of a book club with anyone living or dead, who would it be?
That's such a hard question. Well, I think we've got to start from the top, and I'll Jane Austen. I just have Jane Austen there because how could you not?
Yeah.
I'm not sure I could keep up with her mentally, but I think she'd probably have some quite pithy social observations about what was going on at the dinner table. I think I'd have Darwin there as well, but I might quite like to also have David Attenborough there so they can have a nice conversation and I can just sort of listen and see what they're chatting about and not have to make any conversation. But then also some, like, growing up, I read a lot of Goosebumps books by an author called R.L. Stine, and they were sort of middle grade YA horror books, and they were always things like The Ventriloquist Dummy That Came to Life, or The Blob That Ate My Neighbor's Dog, or something like that, you know, really sort of wild and outlandish things. And I just think he'd be really fun to have at the dinner table and sort of see where his ideas come from. So I think that would be quite a varied mix.
Oh, that would be a fabulous conversation. You could go so many places with that one. And I'm just going to let the audience know too that if you have a question, feel free to pop it in the chat box and we'll get to them shortly. Ginger's just said Goosebumps is a movie too. Have you seen the movie?
They did do a Goosebumps movie, yeah. There used to be a TV show here back in the day, and it was very retro and really, really interesting. So yeah, I think he'd be a good dinner party guest.
Are there any other genres that you'd like to give your hand to besides historical fiction?
It's interesting. I would like to try, I think, to write a thriller. The thing is with historical fiction, the best part is that you do get to do all this research, and I find that really interesting because you get to immerse yourself in this new subject and just learn. You know, you can find something that interests you and you can spend months just learning about that thing. You know, how great is that? That's
fantastic.
That's so fantastic, and I can't believe that I get to do that. So that is why I love historical fiction so much. However, I would love to try my hand at a thriller. But I think probably it would be a thriller set in quite a remote place or something like that, because there would always have to be that, you know, I love writing about wild settings and nature and things like that. So I don't know if you know the author Lucy Foley, but she does that really well. She was a historical fiction author before she started writing thrillers. And she does them really well. You know, the writing is really beautiful, but it's also really compelling and page turning. But also I think I'd love to write a horror. I'd love to write a horror novel and see how that goes. One of my favorite books that I read in the past year or so is called The Last House on Needless Street by an author called, I don't know if it's Catriona or Katrina Ward. And it's absolutely fantastic. On the surface, it's a really, really creepy horror novel. And on the front cover, it's got a Stephen King quote. But there's this massive twist at the end, and you realize that actually perhaps what you've been reading isn't horror after all. Perhaps it's sort of psychological and things. It's so clever, and I would love to have written that book. I would really, really recommend that book to anyone who hasn't read it.
Okay, so we'll have to, what was the name of it again? We might get Yvonne to pop it in the chat.
It's called The Last House on Needless Street. It's brilliant.
Okay, Last House on Needless Street. We've got a question from Eleanor, and she's saying, you said that the idea stage of the book comes naturally to you. How do you decipher between the good ideas and the ones that aren't worth following through?
Oh, it's such a good question. And I think it depends if I can see how to take that initial idea, because that initial idea might be something like, not even an idea, just a subject that I think is interesting. So, for example, I was in Whitstable the other day and there was a plaque that was talking about the ships that brought ice from Norway to the UK when we didn't have ice in the UK. And I was like, how interesting. I wonder what it would have been like to be on those ships filled with this ice. You know, that is the spark of something, but that's really just a subject. What will determine whether or not you can turn it into a book is whether you can build a propelling story around that and sort of extend it out to a novel's length. So there's definitely an alchemy to it. And I'm not, you know, I think it just depends on whether there's enough meat to a subject to delve into it and sort of turn it into lots of different things. But it's definitely something I struggle with. I have so many ideas in my phone, well, subjects and things like that. And it does take a while to sit down, because you have to also research around that subject to then learn if there's enough to turn it into something. Because there might perhaps have been something else happening at that time in that part of the world that you could feed into the story as well and explore as well. But you have to do that initial research in order to establish that. So I think it just takes a while to sort of probe those things a bit further. And also, I just think it depends if it's something that fascinates you, because that is what you will need in order to carry you through writing a book. Because writing a book is a slog. You know, it takes a long time and a lot of energy, and you have to have, you know, and then once you've written the book, you have to then spend months editing that book, and then you talk about that book and those subjects for a long time. So you'll be best placed if it's something that really truly fascinates you and you're willing to sit with that for a long, long time.
That's a great answer. It is a great answer. Nikki has popped in there, I love your book cover, and we were just admiring this before. It is a beautiful, get that right, a beautiful cover. How much input did you have?
Oh, this is really interesting, because that's something that I do get asked, and the answer is not a lot. As an author, you're not sort of given free rein as to what goes on your book cover. But actually, that's probably a good thing, because, you know, the publishers know what they're doing. They know what's going to sell for a particular market. They know the vibe they think is going to be best sort of commercially for your book as well. So while I did, actually, my publishers were really receptive to me sending over things like mood boards or Pinterest boards or ideas for covers or things like that. That doesn't mean that they necessarily sort of took any notice of them, but they were willing to receive them. But all the covers are very different for each territory, which is interesting as well. But all of the publishers have been open to my feedback on their designs. So they've presented a cover and said, you know, this is what we're thinking of going for in terms of the final cover. What do you think? And I've been lucky in that I've been able to say, I wonder if we could put this boat on the back, or I wonder if this color would work better, or if, you know, we can use a different font, or if she can be looking in the other direction, you know, things like that. So you can give that sort of feedback, but it's certainly, I haven't been able to say, this is what I think should go on the front cover, and this is how I think it should go. But I have been really lucky in that I genuinely do love all the different covers, and it's been really interesting to see how the different countries interpret the book as well. So, for example, I saw my Finnish cover, as in the cover that's coming out in Finland, and it's so incredibly different to all the other covers. It's beautiful. It's got sort of a bowerbird on the front with a pearl in its beak that looks like the moon.
Ah.
And they've taken, you know, lots of the motifs from the book, like insects and purling luggers and things like that. And it's just so beautiful to see that they've interpreted the story in that way, and they've drawn out those themes. And then another territory has focused on Eliza as the main motif, or a ship, or something like that. So that's been really interesting. And it's just the most exciting thing to get an email, and, you know, it's the cover of your book in your inbox.
Oh.
It's so incredibly exciting.
So speaking of how different countries or territories interpreted the book cover, did you have to change the title of your book? Because that happens sometimes too in any countries.
No, I didn't. But the thing is, with the translation editions, they can interpret the title differently. So, for example, the translation in Finland is something like The Pearl Fisher's Daughter, which is really nice and just works in their language. But in the UK, the US, Canada, and Australia, the title has remained the same. And so I think that's really nice, because it's a title that me and my the dedication at the front of my book is for Rose, and it's a title that we came up with together when we were on a walk. So that's really nice. And it's nice that it stayed. Yeah.
Oh, that's a really lovely thing. Speaking of Rose, there's a Rosie in here who has asked a question. Is feminist Western a genre you've created?
No, I haven't created it, but I do think it's something that's sort of gaining in popularity, especially with and I love it. For somebody to call my book a feminist Western, I think that's fantastic. So with there was a Netflix series called Godless, which was about a mining town where all the men had died in this mining disaster, and so it was basically run by women. That was really great. And there's also a book called Outlawed by Anna North, which is about a woman who joins the Hole in the Wall gang and robs banks and stuff like that, basically. But that gang is made up of women or non-binary characters, and so that's really interesting in that genre as well. And even things like How Much of These Hills is Gold, which is a brilliant book by C. Pam Shang, I think her name is. That sort of crosses over into feminist Western. So no, I definitely haven't created the genre, but I feel very happy to be perhaps sort of coexisting in that space. I think it's a really interesting one to be in.
Yeah, that is, I don't even think I've heard of that genre before. I think there's so many little offshoots of different ones. How does it feel to know an author you admire has read your book?
Oh, it's the most bizarre and lovely and gratifying feeling. So when you write a book, especially as a debut, you're an unknown, nobody knows what you're doing, who you are, but your publisher will send your book out to established authors to get them to read it and perhaps endorse it if they like it. And I just remember getting my first author endorsement through, and it was just I can't even describe the feeling of it. It's just, I'm so grateful that anyone would take the time to even read my book, but then to be so generous to sort of throw their hat into the ring to endorse it as well. It's just the greatest kindness, I think. And that's what's been really lovely about the sort of change in career to becoming an author, is other authors. I couldn't have done this without the support of other authors, and they are so lovely, and they're going through exactly the same thing as you. And I think perhaps, I don't know if Nikki's still on this chat. Oh, yes, she is. I can see her. That she has just been the most supportive person to me throughout this, and it's just really, really lovely to be on that journey with other people as well. I think at the start I thought, oh, the best thing about this is going to be having a book out in the world, and it's not. It's meeting people that I wouldn't have crossed paths with perhaps otherwise, just because we don't live in the same part of the world, or we're in different jobs or something like that. It's been so lovely.
And there is a real community of authors out there. I've met a few authors, and they are just so supportive of each other and really helpful in the process. And because you write by yourself a lot of the time, I imagine it would be very nice to have that little community to go to.
Yeah, definitely. And I think people sometimes think that, there's competitiveness, and, there might be, I don't know, there certainly isn't in the authors that I know. They've all been really, really supportive of one another. And I'm actually on a Twitter group with a lot of debut authors who are all coming out in 2022. And it's been really nice for everyone to be able to share the ups and downs and vulnerabilities and worries with one another. And we'll, be messaging sort of throughout the day. There's always messages on that group, or if somebody gets a great author endorsement, or if somebody sees their cover for the first time and they just want to share that with other people who know exactly how that feels, it's really, really you know, really lovely to be in that community. And I would say, you know, you don't even have to have published a book to be in those communities. They're really lovely author communities or writing communities on Twitter that are just really welcoming of everyone that's having a go and trying to write and putting their bum in the seat and bashing out a story. So yeah, it's a very welcoming place. I think that's been really lovely.
Yeah, it's yeah, I like the writing communities that I see. And I was going to ask you one more question. Is there any more questions from anybody else before? Have I missed anybody's questions? Because let me just check. Nope, haven't missed anybody's questions. Would you like to read a section of your book for us?
Yes, I'm just going to read a couple of paragraphs from close to the beginning of the novel, just to sort of get a feel for the sense of the book. A pearling lugger can find itself at sea for several long months, its crew returning to shore preserved in thick layers of salt like dried herrings. Alone on their small wooden boats facing riptides and swirling currents, it is no surprise bonds are formed out at sea that no incident nor man could ever break. As they toil, lead-weighted boots keep the divers fixed to the ocean floor, along with heavy chest plates and a copper corset worn over the shoulders. Eliza has read newspaper reports detailing men knocked off their boats by the boom, left to sink to their deaths under the weight of all that metal. The tender must take care to pull his diver up slowly, her father would say. Not to do so could leave him agonizingly crippled. Men were pulled up dead. Of course they were. Crushed out of recognition, stomachs forced into their chest cavities. Others met death with bloated faces, tongues black and swollen, frantic eyes popped clean from their sockets. The White Starling has been out for nearly 9 weeks now, its men plucking shell from the seabed and stashing it in the hold with the dried fish and curry powder. Eliza has witnessed many times the men's return from sea, pinched, hollow-eyed apparitions drifting listlessly from their ships, their visible bones like a collection of piano keys ready to be played. Bit of a dark passage, but gives a sense of sort of the industry at the time.
Yeah, it's a beautiful book. I've really enjoyed reading it, and I especially like hearing an author read a section of the book. So if you haven't read it yet, you can go out and grab a copy of Lizzie's book. This is it here. If you're in Australia, it is only new out, so you might have to ask around a bit. I did find this one in QBD. Just put it out there. They were very helpful. Audible has it. And of course, the library has copies coming in. Central Coast Library has copies coming in very shortly. We've managed to snuffle a copy onto our Borrow Box, which is our ebook platform, and somebody snapped it up just like that. So hopefully you'll get your hands on a copy soon, and I hope that you enjoy it as much as I have. I've really raced through it. And yeah, I think that you've done really great, and I really appreciate you coming in having a chat with us tonight.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, and thank you everyone for coming.